Digital Synergies speaker series. Digital Synergies is a research signature area at the University of Alberta. The goal of the signature area's initiative at the U of A is to create opportunities for faculty members and students in different areas to come together and around common themes. And digital obviously is highly multidisciplinary area. So Digital Synergies really represents a great opportunity to bring together folks from various disciplines to talk about current issues and topics that touch on a wide range of questions and issues. And today we're really lucky to have Gregory and Catherine here to talk about their forthcoming book. And this speaker series that they are part of is really intended to highlight and feature current and emerging publications in the field. And there's so much going on right now that it's often hard to choose what what we want to look at. But this is going to be a very important area as we go forward, and as you'll learn today. So before I start and really get into it, I'd like to acknowledge that the University of Alberta is located on Treaty 6 territory, and that we respect the histories, languages, and cultures of First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and all First Peoples of Canada, whose presence continues to enrich our vibrant community. Today, I'm pleased to have Gregory Taylor and Catherine Middleton join us to talk about their new book, Frequencies, published by McGill Queen's University Press. Greg is Associate Professor in the Department of Communication, Media, and Film at the University of Calgary. And Catherine is a professor in the Ted Rogers School of Management at Ryerson University. Together, they've put together a collection of perspectives from around the world that provides an interdisciplinary and multinational exploration of current and future policy for this foundational resource that is integral to all mobile media, the radio spectrum. I'm delighted to have them with us today to discuss this important topic. Spectrum doesn't usually get the attention it deserves in media and communication studies. It can be passed over as a dry technical subject for the engineers, but a closer look at spectrum reveals a rich history of social and political intrigue when it comes to how this natural resource has been harnessed and put into service for our modern media systems. And today, more than ever, as we look ahead at 5G and the Internet of Things, we really need to understand how spectrum policy is going to shape the future of human communication. We'll take questions at the end. We'll set aside some time for that, but please feel free to post comments if you have questions as we go along, and we'll return to those at the end. Welcome, Greg and Catherine.
Hey, thanks very much, Gordon. And I want to start by saying that the book is not forthcoming. It's here. And it's been out by McGill Queen's Press since the summer. And so a lot of what we're talking about today is what appears in here. It is available. Makes a lovely stocking stuffer for the holiday season coming up too. So anyway, we are really happy that we've been able to put this together. And Catherine and I have a slight technical issue in that I'm going to have to, I guess, give a little notice to move on to the next slide. But so Catherine, if we could just get going on the first slide here. Let's hope this works. There we go. Okay. So I'm going to start just with the title of the book, that it was a bit of a play on words when we were putting this together, in that the two main areas as to why we chose the word frequencies. Well, first off, it's what we call the radio waves upon which our mobile data rides. Those are the frequencies. But then the other reason we decided to go with this title is that we found certain reoccurring challenges in spectrum policy, and we looked at areas across the globe. And what we discovered, well, first off, that we were surprised that we hadn't seen a lot of this before, as far as international studies in this area. But what we have and we also noticed that there are a lot of similarities. We tend to look at things locally or nationally, but we found similarities across the board or across the world. So we had frequent reoccurring issues, and ones that we were kind of surprised that they haven't really been addressed at a more global level, because they seem to be popping up all over the place. Catherine, if we'll just go to the next one then. So the other thing that we wanted to point out, and Gordon kind of hinted at this in the introduction as well, the importance of spectrum, aside from the fact that all of our mobile data, and we're becoming increasingly mobile in our connectivity around the world, the other thing that's so important about spectrum is that it is a public resource. The public owns the radio waves. We always have. And this is often, it's the foundational element as to why governments are able to control this in the first place, why they are the keepers of spectrum. It is a public resource. And so I think that when we talk about the social issues of spectrum and the political power struggles that are going on behind, it's at the foundational level. It's because we're talking about something that we all own. And so we should have a say. But as Gordon said in the introduction, far too often, this gets left to the engineers to talk about. Whereas we're talking about something that we all should have a voice, because it belongs to all of us. And this is not a Canadian thing. This is not an American thing. This is around the world, that this is a public resource. Catherine, if you could just jump to the next one, please. So we started this book a few years ago. Now, it sort of came to fruition at a conference which Catherine and I put together at the University of Calgary. It was called the Spectrum Summit, Canadian Spectrum Summit. A lot of the people involved in this book were part of that conference. And what surprised me as I got into this is, why has this never been done before? To the best of our knowledge, this is the first book that is a truly global approach to the question of spectrum policy. And in some ways, this made no sense to me. We've been coordinating spectrum since 1903. The first international summit to coordinate the use of spectrum is in 1903, and yet at an academic level, we almost always still remain in national silos. That we look at what is needed in our countries, but the more we got into this, we realized, okay, we're part of an international community this way. Why do we not have an international study on this area? And the other thing, Gordon talked about how for this speaker series, you're looking for something that's interdisciplinary. And we all hear that. I mean, in academia right now, we hear interdisciplinary used on a regular basis. But it's impossible to study spectrum without taking an interdisciplinary approach. It simply doesn't work. So it is by its very nature interdisciplinary. And when we started looking into this area, and Catherine and I have been part of a study in spectrum policy now for, since 2013, we noticed that the humanities and social sciences in particular often fear to tread in this area. They're spooked for some reason by the study of spectrum. Now, we talk about this in the introduction to the book. A lot of it is the technical jargon that's involved. It can be hard to get away from it. But the engineers are there. The economists are there. There are a lot of groups that recognize the importance of this publicly owned and controlled resource. But humanities and social sciences often weren't exactly around to discuss this. So I thought that it was important. My background is entirely in the arts and social sciences. I wanted to take a look at spectrum from more of a social perspective and take a look at the wider political economy of spectrum management. Catherine, if we can go to the next one. And so this is from the actual book. This is a quote from the introduction, and it's a little more wordy than I would like in a slide, but I thought it was important. So what frequencies has to offer here is a unique perspective. It's a collection of original independent academic research on spectrum policy from scholars working in different disciplines representing various corners of the globe. By its nature, the field of spectrum policy incorporates economics, political science, communication studies, history, engineering, and science and technology studies. The diverse chapters serve to clarify common global concerns as well as local differences. So we kind of invited everybody to this. And often it was people who were not used to being in the same room with each other. In fact, one of our participants, Martin Wise from Pittsburgh, talked about that after, about how much he enjoyed talking with people from the arts and humanities because he's from engineering. And he thought that there were new and important perspectives being brought forward here. So I guess our takeaway on all this is that, especially in an area like media and communication studies, again, by its nature, I would argue interdisciplinary, we shouldn't shy away from this. That this is a field where we should be having a voice. It's a public issue. It's a social, an issue of equity. It's a social justice issue. There are all of these areas that play in. But yes, you're going to encounter the engineers. You're going to encounter the technical jargon. Don't be spooked. It's there's a lot of important work that the social sciences and humanities can bring to this, and you need to work with people from other disciplines to make it work. Catherine, if we can go to the next one.
Okay, so let me jump in here for a while. What I want to do is just give an overview of the way the book's structured and of some of the central themes in the book. So there are 11 chapters, all up, 17 different contributors. We started by, the book is sort of informally divided into sections. So the first broad section is the one that we see on the slide here, which is the international case studies. And as Greg said, we really had excellent representation around the world. So we started in New Zealand, to Finland. We had a chapter and discussion that was Pan-African. I had one chapter specifically on the Canadian context, went to Latin America with Mexico, and then to India. So pretty good global coverage. We had in our second section, which is shorter chapter-wise, 2 chapters looking specifically at spectrum sharing, but you'll see when I get into the slides that follow, looking at themes, spectrum sharing is an issue that came up repeatedly across the chapters. And one of the things that we pushed our authors to do, some more successfully than others, I think, but everybody made an effort, was to talk to the other chapters. I think often what happens in edited collections is that the chapters are entirely standalone, which is not a bad thing. It's good that you can take the chapter out and use it in a class or something. But we did try to have people speaking to each other as well to draw some of the threads that I will also try to draw here. The closing 3 chapters, and then these are bookended with an introduction and a conclusion written by Greg and myself. But the closing 3 chapters really focus on visions for the future. So ways of thinking about both assigning and sharing spectrum to allow for far more flexible uses. And then the final chapter looks specifically at questions related to 5G. We should say as well, the chapters were written initially in 2017, updated in 2018. So they represent the state of the world at the time that they were written. I was just reviewing them yesterday. I think they stand up pretty well, but recognizing that, of course, some things have changed since the time that the book went to print. So to give an overview of some of the central themes. I think Greg has spoken to this already, as did Gordon in the introduction. Want to think about the importance of framing spectrum policy as more than just the technical questions of what frequency is this radio going to operate on, and who has the license for it, and how did we get the license into that to that particular organization. There is much, much more to spectrum policy than those questions, though those are often the dominant ones. So one of the interesting examples that we see in the book is in the introductory chapter, Zita Joyce's discussion of the Maori claims on spectrum in New Zealand, and the recognition there, although I am not as firmly embedded as a policy as I think could be possible given some of the political discussions, but the recognition that there is a Maori claim to spectrum, that it is a natural resource that's shared, as Greg said, with cultural meaning. It's more than just the socio-economic. There's more to it there. We see examples in Finland where spectrum policy is used to support industry. So the interests of Nokia being part of the story there. We see also in Finland and in some of the discussions in Africa, and enabling a little bit of what's possible in Canada, the transition from digital television to mobile services, but the recognition that spectrum is also still used for digital television. So it's not just mobile, although often we think of it those ways, I think, now. And also the interplay between license exempt spectrum and fiber, which is really important as people are looking to extend access into communities. So you may be able to get fiber close to a community and then build the last mile or the first mile, as Rob McMahon and others would say, and Brian Beaton, I think, is on the call as well. Have that first mile with Wi-Fi over license exempt spectrum. Certainly auctions are important. They're a central piece of this. So our first chapter gives us a little bit of the history of the first auctions. Often Americans say that auctions started in the US. Actually, they started in New Zealand. What they found in New Zealand, though, and this has been the case in other places as well, when you have a fairly small market with not a large number of operators and not a whole lot of demand, the auctions don't necessarily generate a lot of revenue because there isn't the competition that would drive that. So while governments, I think often, and the book provides many examples of this, often see auctions as an opportunity to raise revenues, we have many examples to indicate that doesn't always happen, that things don't play out that way. And it speaks as well to the importance of recognizing that local solutions and local contexts are different. So the models that were started in Europe, when those were brought into Africa and some of the reserve pricing practices, they just didn't translate, they didn't work, and auctions failed. So recognizing that although auctions are pretty widely used, there are limitations to them, and the chapters discuss those. Also, as Ben Klass's chapter looks at in the Canadian context, which I think we're all pretty familiar with, just providing spectrum isn't enough to ensure that competitors can actually establish viable businesses. I want to comment a little bit about spectrum sharing. So the recognition that while there are limits to the spectrum, that even when it's assigned to particular parties, it's not always being fully used. So the quote that we have at the top of this slide from Michael Marcus, recognizing even today there's much idle spectrum in areas where there is an unmet demand. So to the extent that spectrum can be shared, it allows for better, more efficient use of it. And Martin Cave and William Webb, in their closing chapter, make the argument that they really think it would be helpful to have a position where almost all licenses are shared. We have some examples. Television white space, TV, WS. Some examples really of how that hasn't lived up to its potential. Some discussion, Michael Marcus in particular, talking about secondary uses of public safety and military spectrum, which would allow for more capacity in some of the larger markets potentially. And Greg's chapter on the RRBS systems, which are particularly prevalent in Alberta. So I'll just comment as well to add to the observations about spectrum sharing. There are 2 chapters towards the end of the book that offer, these are ones where I think both sets of authors are predominantly engineers. So they're somewhat more technical in their approach, but they still offer accessible visions, I guess, of models of how spectrum could be governed. In the first instance, in Martin Weiss and Marcelo Gomez's chapter, polycentric governance is the term that they use. So this recognition that there are multiple parties that can be adapting to each other in very local, small scale conditions. So rather than somebody having the spectrum license for all of Southern Ontario or all of Alberta, there can be uses between one farm and the neighboring farm and the farm beside that with their connected cows. It's one of the examples that they use. And then in Linda Doyle and her colleagues' chapter, they're looking at a model where spectrum is broken into very discrete blocks. And I'm sort of doing a Rubik's Cube type thing with my hands. This is partly how they describe it, where you're putting these blocks together based on a combination of frequency, time, and who it's being allocated to. And the idea there is that you can dynamically say, okay, I'm running an event. I need an additional amount of spectrum for the event for a weekend in this location. And you could go to a wholesaler, get that spectrum, and then you're finished, the event's done, you move on. You didn't have to build a network. You didn't have to bring in cells on wheels, any of those sorts of things. So both of these are quite innovative models that are using technical descriptions of what can be done with radios and new ways of thinking about licensing to give us some alternative perspectives on how spectrum can be used in I guess, more efficient way, how it can be shared more. Okay, so back over to Greg.
Okay, thank you, Catherine. So I thought that I'd just bring up a couple of things here on this idea of unlicensed. To understand unlicensed, I think you have to understand licensed, which is how we generally do it right now. Generally speaking, the way that spectrum is allocated right now in Canada, it is overwhelmingly now done via auctions where people bid on exclusive licenses. So you might get a 10 megahertz a block of spectrum. You bid on that often in a certain area of the country, and you get exclusive access to that spectrum. And generally speaking, the contracts, even though they say they're buying the spectrum, it's more like they're renting it or leasing it when you get spectrum, because it's a 20-year, generally speaking, a 20-year contract or license that you get for the spectrum. Catherine and I have argued a few times that we find 20 years too long for these licenses, that it's simply locking away too much spectrum into exclusive use, because of exactly what some of our authors said and what Catherine just went over. There is an incredibly dynamic area right now around unlicensed technology. What happens when it is not locked away, but is left open to others? One of the authors we have in the book, Michael Marcus, and Catherine's quoted some of his work, known by some as the godfather of Wi-Fi, because when he was with the FCC in the 1980s, he was among the engineers who said, let's take this little bit of spectrum here and nobody owns it. It will be left open to development. And as he himself will tell you, They didn't know what Wi-Fi was, or that was necessarily what was going to happen there. But it is what happened. It's this frequency that ends up being used for a lot of unlicensed things like Wi-Fi, which has since grown and one of the most successful unlicensed approaches we have in the world, and a lot of other areas, from baby monitors to garage door openers. Nobody owns that spectrum. It's unlicensed. We often, it's built into the technology. Why does your Wi-Fi only go so far? It's because it's how it operates on those frequencies. You can't have a range of 5 kilometers for your garage door opener or your baby monitor. So the idea of unlicensed spectrum, you're never quite sure what's going to happen there. This is, and I thought when Catherine and I were talking about our talk today, we thought it was important to keep bringing things back to what's happening right now. Well, this is last week, and looking right now, the Ottawa is looking to triple the access for Wi-Fi spectrum in Canada. This is on very high frequencies. I'll be interested to see what kind of range it will have, but clearly this is something that Ottawa has kind of tuned into right now, the importance of keeping some things open. So basically what it comes down to, Rogers, Bell, TELUS will not own this spectrum. They might use it. Often they might use it for things like backhaul in their system. Backhaul is part of the network. But I think that we'll see what this ends up being used for. It's at a much higher frequency than a lot of what we're using right now. But this just came out. So all that to say, a lot of what we're talking about in the book plays out right now in things that we're seeing at a current level. Catherine, can we jump ahead a little, please? Okay, so this one is the area that just doesn't seem to go away as an issue. And in our book, one of the first things that we noticed, as again, the title of it being frequencies, the most frequent thing that came up is the idea of rural access and the divide between rural and urban areas. It's a global issue. And despite decades of market-based spectrum policy, this remains an issue that, yes, in Canada, we talk about this all the time. I'm going to get to that in just a second. But what we really have to get at here, and what the book is about, this is not a Canadian issue. This is a global issue. How do you get connectivity out to the last 10%, and in other countries it's more than 10% who live in the rural areas? And so Catherine pointed out that the first auction of in spectrum happened in New Zealand. It was in 1991. 1991 to today is pretty much the peak period of what in academia we call the neoliberal era, where we rely on market forces. And so we had a market-based spectrum policy, not just in Canada, but in most places of the world. And quite simply, it has not delivered in rural areas. There is no economic rationale for putting out service into a lot of rural parts of Canada. And this isn't new. This has always been the case. Whenever we're talking about this and people say, oh, you're high-tech, new technology, we talked about this with radio in the 20s. We talked about it with the telephone for decades in the last century. There's not really a market rationale for getting service out to a lot of the rural areas. Catherine, can we go ahead? So what we found in the book was that some other countries are taking really interesting and innovative approaches to this in ways that Canada and other countries are not. And one of them is pretty close by. The Mexican approach has this thing they're calling red compartida. And forgive me for anyone who speaks Spanish on the call. I don't pretend to have any Spanish ability. What they did was they took the 700 megahertz band of spectrum. That's important because it travels far and it goes through a lot. Again, you can't ignore the engineering side of it. 700 megahertz travels far, it goes through buildings, it goes through trees. It's what we used for television broadcasts here in Canada. They took that whole block of spectrum and used it for a wholesale network to reach universal service targets. What they did was they took that whole block, which, by the way, Canada chopped up and sold to other, we have the same, everybody has the same spectrum. We sold ours in exclusive licenses. Mexico tried this thing where the government built out a a wholesale network across the country and was allowing small providers to provide service to rural areas off the nationalized, what they call backbone, where they had a nationally built system, but they didn't provide service to the home. Again, the term that Catherine used was the last mile. And the last mile was provided by small local providers and or national smaller providers, what are called MVNOs in the telecom policy area. So Mexico took the whole 700 megahertz band and didn't sell it. They used it for a national network. And so they took a very different approach from Canada. The other thing that we looked at was the case of India. India that still has many small rural communities. They still have a much larger rural population than Canada, though the cities are growing by the day. They also took a different approach. So the book where I think it's very useful is, I mean, there's people on this call I know that know the Canadian system rather well. To take a look at what's happening in other countries can really give a different perspective. Catherine, can we just jump ahead? And for the communication scholars on the call, again, this is not a new problem. It goes back to Innis. The economic history of Canada has been dominated by the discrepancy between the center and the margin. So again, I always find it important to note here, this is not brand new. This is an issue we've been dealing with for a while. Can we go ahead, please? This has also been something that has been brought up in the US, and this is Barack Obama in 2010. Expanded wireless broadband access will trigger the creation of innovative new businesses, provide cost-effective connections in rural areas, increase productivity, improve public safety, and allow for the development of mobile, telemedicine, telework, distance learning, and other new applications that will transform American lives. This is Obama in 2010. Where I disagree with some colleagues is that I understand that for a lot of people that the emphasis needs to be on fiber, that we need to get fiber out to these rural areas. And I agree, that would be fantastic. Where I split is I'm not convinced that we're going to be doing that soon. I think that the last mile for the foreseeable future in rural areas will have to be wireless. And so what Obama is saying here is that this is cost effective, in particular for rural areas. That last mile, which is often from the road to the house, is really expensive. And we can do it wirelessly, where one tower can cover a whole area and provide point-to-point, a fixed wireless access for an entire area. For the time being, this to me is the way we should be looking at rural access. And I recognize there are some people who disagree and think we need to be focusing on fiber, but this strikes me as one that's just a little more feasible for the foreseeable future. Can we go on, please? Okay, and the other thing I like to point out is that, boy, Canada loves to talk about rural broadband. We've been doing it for a long time. Since the 90s, we have announced and re-announced different programs about connecting rural Canada. We had Connecting Canadians in the 90s, Broadband for Rural and Northern Development in 2002 to 2007, Broadband Canada, Connecting Rural Canadians from 2009 to 2012, Connect to Innovate was in 2018, and now we have the Universal Broadband Fund in 2019. So this is just of the last 20 years. So this is something that we've been, an issue that just does not seem to go away. Again, not Canadian in its entirety. It's all over the world, but it sure pops up a lot here. And politicians love to bring this up. This is conservative and liberal. It's not any one group. Catherine, go to the next one, please. And so again, to try and tie things to the present, this is this month as well. So two things that we're talking about here have played out within this month. This is Trudeau announcing broadband service for rural Canadians from CBC News on November the 9th of this month. So again, there's this, the government involvement and the government talk in this area is something that's been around for a long time. And what I think we can offer here is at least some different perspectives of how we go about approaching this issue. Catherine? Okay, so this is the looking at the Mexican model. This is from their website. And yes, there's a little problem with the translation in their English, but that's fine. Red Compartida, the biggest telecommunications project in the Mexico history. So this is Mexico's use of this huge chunk of spectrum. They could have made billions on it, but instead they've decided that their connectivity was so weak in the earlier parts of this century that they needed to do something about it. And they took this rather drastic step. Catherine, can you go ahead? So Mexico is the only country in Latin America to not auction the 700 megahertz. They didn't auction it because the recent reform to the Constitution mandated the totality of it be used for the creation of Red Compartida. So it's actually in their Constitution. So whereas Canada, and I know there's a few people on this call that could tell me right away how much money we made on the 700 megahertz auction. I think it's in the 3 billion zone, but I'm not exactly sure. Mexico forfeited that to build out a national network that was going to be available to all. Judith Marescal wrote this section in our book. Catherine? So it's a wide-ranging reform in 2014, the construction of 2 wholesale networks with the objective of offering broadband to unserved areas and stimulating competition in the market. The backbone network is Red Troncal, and Red Compartida is the wireless shared part that's it's the final part of the process. So Mexico brought in a very different approach, not pursuing the auction paradigm, and trying this as a wholesale network built by the government, financed by the government. Sorry, they didn't actually physically build it, that was going to offer service to the home wirelessly at the end. Move ahead, please. So one thing we can see here, though, is that subscriptions in Mexico have been jumping since 2010. But look at the beginning of this chart. Look where they were in 2010, how low that is. So there's been a steady growth in Mexico as far as mobile broadband subscriptions since then. They went from virtually nothing, and it was an incredibly concentrated market. Carlos Slim, former president, was actually someone who also, sorry, no, it wasn't the president. I got to double check that. He also was running all the mobile broadband in the country. So there's been this massive increase in Mexico. The policy comes in 2014. There's been a big jump since then. So there's a lot that's changed in this period. Catherine, can you move ahead, please? So following the telecom reform bill, prices have dropped between 69% and 81%. So there's been a big change that's happened from this. Okay, Catherine. Looking at India now, I'm going to 2 very different countries, but again, struggling with the very Canadian issue of delivering service to the final section in rural areas. Of India's 400, oh, Catherine, I think that jumped ahead one. Where did it go? How do we go back? There we go. Of India's 446 million internet subscribers, 75% are in the urban areas. So again, it's a very urban thing. Can we move ahead, please? Okay, forgive another lengthy quote here, but I think it's important. Although licenses were allocated for mobile broadband in the 3G and 4G services, their deployment is limited often to urban areas. Many operators won spectrum via the 2014 auctions, but 4G developments were limited. 4G is what most of us are using right now, to large urban areas due to lack of devices, ecosystem, financial constraint. While 3G services have been licensed since 2010, they're mostly limited again to urban areas. Large parts of the mobile network are still 2G. So that's flip phone stuff. The gaps in teledensity, extent of 3G and 4G, LTE network deployments, and smartphone adoption show the magnitude of the rural-urban divide in India. So India, yes, there is in the major cities some of the newer technologies, but most of the other areas are still in second generation. Catherine, can we go ahead? And this again for India, and I think it just sounds so Canadian. The established mobile network operators have been slow to deploy mobile broadband network in rural areas because of concerns regarding viability, lack of demand, and profitability. we could be talking about anywhere in Canada in rural areas right now. Move ahead, please. India did something very similar to Mexico, that they built, the government funded a fiber backbone with companies then delivering service off the national private backbone called BharatNet. And so this was the Digital India Initiative, so somewhat similar to what happened in Mexico. But once again, governments really intervening when markets did not deliver. Move ahead, please, Catherine. And so this was from our book, from the authors Prabir Neogi and Rika Jain, who wrote, in developing countries, government funding is often necessary to kickstart broadband deployment, as it requires huge capital investment and short-term returns are uncertain due to demand risks. The business case for broadband deployment in rural areas is even more risky. So the point we're getting at here is that in this era where we relied more and more on market forces, the market forces simply didn't deliver, certainly not in Mexico and India, into these rural areas. So it was a very risky venture to begin with, to rely on markets for this, and it didn't quite play out that way. Okay, can we move ahead, please, Catherine? You want to take that?
Sure. So coming to the conclusion, we have several chapters, several authors that really help us think about what the future might look like, decisions that could be made to treat spectrum in different ways. So really interesting chapters on the different ways of thinking about sharing spectrum, the Weiss and Gomez chapter and Linda Doyle and her colleagues chapter. And I recommend the entire book, but certainly the chapter on 5G is very timely. I am looking at the policy and technology changes and challenges, although it was written a couple of years ago, it certainly is right on the money in terms of the issues that we are seeing. Ultimately, I think one of the policy questions that the book both addresses and continues to pose as being a question that needs more consideration is how to make spectrum available in ways that can accommodate change that either we can't see or it's out there but we don't recognize it. Some of the examples that were used were the emergence of smartphones. So when there were initial discussions of digital dividend with television, smartphones weren't necessarily in the mix. The recognition of the use of higher frequencies, millimeter wave for 5G, that's a change as well. And ultimately thinking throughout all of this discussion about how to ensure that a focus on economic impact doesn't shortchange or eliminate the realization of social benefits at the same time. So I think that's it for the presentation, and I'll just close by thanking SSHRC, Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, for their support for the project through an insight grant that Greg was the PI and I was the co-investigator on that. So I will stop sharing now. I'll take a look at the chat.
Thank you, Catherine and Greg. That was great. I've just got my eye on the chat here, Catherine and Greg. If you guys want to have a glance at the chat, feel free to jump in. I just wanted to, I guess maybe for the benefit of the audience that might not be familiar with 5G or only know of it from seeing these ads on TV. I mean, what 5G really kind of drives a hyper demand for spectrum, doesn't it? I mean, what's going on here with 5G, and what is it? What is 5G, and what does it mean for spectrum?
Well, right now, as far as what it is the next generation of wireless technology. What it is exactly going to do is still somewhat up in the air. A lot of the real applications of 5G are still out there. I mean, there's talk of that it could be used for connecting automobiles. It will be, for example, they're talking about antennas on every streetlight in certain areas. What it will do is move much more data than we do right now. We're on the 4th generation right now. And so it will move way more data But the point that some are making that it's already here is really debatable, because the speeds and the data transfers we're getting from what they're calling 5G right now are fairly limited. The increases are generally minimal right now. It could be coming in a few years that we're going to get this massive new data transfers. But what's important, and the point that you're getting at, Gordon, that it requires a lot more spectrum to move this much data. So we'll see. The governments around the world right now are setting aside spectrum for 5G. There are those who wonder if what we're seeing is an incredible spectrum heist that's going on around the world by these companies that seem to have an insatiable thirst to acquire more spectrum. And if there are 5G advocates out there that want to argue with me about the beauty of this upcoming technology, I'm all for hearing it. But thus far, we haven't really seen that take, we haven't seen the killer apps yet from 5G. I suspect they're a few years down the road, but it's certainly going to take a lot of spectrum.
I'll just add one point, which comes from the chapter on 5G in the book, which is about the differences in the way the networks are built and the importance of software-defined networking and and I have to keep looking it up, network function virtualization, NFV, which is going to allow operators to slice their spectrum to sort of sell bits of it in different ways, and will allow, commercial considerations aside, will allow for more sharing of network components if operators choose to do that. So there's some technical things, independent of the benefits that Greg's talking about, that will change the operations a little.
Mm-hmm. So I'm just looking at a question coming up that was just posted by Mike Wise. What do I see happening with ATSC 3.0, which is the new broadcast standard that has come out in Canada? Well, it's the new over-the-air broadcasting standard. What do I see happening? I'm not sure. Over-the-air broadcasting in Canada has largely been left on the vine. And what this person, Mike, is asking is, it can be used for other things, emergency alerts, all kinds of other things can be used in the same spectrum. What are we going to do with it? Good question. I simply don't know. But these are the type of socially relevant questions that need to be asked, and why people in the social sciences need to have a foot in the spectrum policy area, because these things matter. In fact, I believe Ontario got their emergency test on their cell phones today. There's another public service done over the air on spectrum. So, okay. I'm going to have to bow. I've got about 3 minutes, then I've got to bow out. Michael McNally, good to see you, Michael. Wondering on Anthony Lacavera's thesis, Canadians are so heavily invested in the big three that Canadian government won't upset their dominance. Michael, so the guy who started Wind Mobile thought the government will not want to rock that boat. Now, he had economic reasons for saying that. I do honestly think that even the Stephen Harper government, and it's Ben Klass in the book goes through this, they tried to bring in new market players in this field. They failed, but they tried. I don't know if I can say with certainty that they're so tied to the big three, or so tied to the government, the Canadian government doesn't want to upset them. I'm not sure. Catherine, do you have any take on that?
No, I don't have anything to add on that. So why don't we go to another question?
Okay.
Greg, do you want to jump into any others, or?
Comment. Okay, Katrina Ingram, can we comment on Elon Musk's Starlink solution to the last mile? The potential's huge here if it happens, if it works. He's talking a mean game right now. It will be very interesting to see. And my hesitation on this, and I'm not always pessimistic on everything, but on some of these, for example, we've had satellite broadband in Canada for quite some time now. ExploreNet has been around for some time. I don't use it, but there's certainly been a lot of concerns as to the quality of service. Now, Elon Musk says that the low orbit satellites they're going to offer will change the game. Perhaps. They also, and there are a couple of people on this call that would know this better than me. They have to have access. Is he licensed in Canada now? There's a couple of things I need to find out on the technical side of this, but it could work. And you're right in that this is a use of spectrum. The spectrum has to be set aside for him to offer this service. And so it's something to watch in the years to come.
I think what's interesting with the low Earth orbit satellites, what I've been hearing from people that I've been speaking to is that there's real excitement about this out in rural Canada. But as Greg said, I think it's really a question of whether the promise will be realized. If it is, though, I think it would change the market for places where fiber isn't possible. So it would likely have a big impact on the fixed internet, the WISPs, that kind of thing, the fixed wireless piece of it. But I think we have to wait and see whether it's technically sound and whether it's affordable as well is always the question. Second part of the question.
If I can just jump in, I have to go. I teach a telecom policy class that starts in 5 minutes here at U of Calgary. If anyone on this call has any questions that they'd like to follow up with, my email is out there, so do not hesitate. And there's a few people on this call I just wish that I'd had a moment to chat with. There's some names of people I haven't seen for a while. So anyway, I hate to be rude, but I've got to go. So Catherine's sticking around, but I've got to go. Okay.
I understand. Thank you, Greg.
Right,
take care. And Catherine, if you can stick around for a few minutes, that would be great.
I can. Yep.
Brian has a question here about changing the narrative. About changing narrative from an inadequate business case.
I agree, Brian, completely. And I think there always needs to be a business case in the sense that there needs to be a provider who can figure out how to offer a service in a way that covers the costs and may or may not make money, but you can't sort of have no business case at all. But I think perhaps what you're getting at, Brian, is that there are business cases that are not big three telecom business cases, that there are many, many, many models that I think many people on the call are familiar with of local communities figuring out business cases that work for them. So it's not to say that there isn't a business case, but it's to say that there are many alternative business cases that keep the profit in communities, that focus on delivering the types of services that communities want. And in fact, I think there are many examples of services being better when communities build them themselves than if they try to put something together that meets a traditional business case. Brian, I don't know if that's exactly the sort of response you were looking for, but I agree wholeheartedly that there's both a need and an opportunity to change that framing of business case.
It's a good question, and I'm thinking, I'm looking at Rob and Michael here too. With Alberta, we have the homegrown example with ONET in Olds, Alberta, where they built their own system. And I was thinking when you were talking about the India example from the book, Alberta has SuperNet, which is a fiber backbone throughout the province, and yet, as both Rob and Michael know, there are many communities that where there's a point of presence with SuperNet, and there's no there is no local service provider at the last mile. And so, how do you what are the essential ingredients to changing that narrative? What are the kinds of things that you have to put in front of policymakers to A, get their attention, and B, make the case?
It's a good question. I think that's what we struggle with a little bit, in that the types of solutions we've come up with And Greg talked about the announcements and the continual announcements that we've seen for rural broadband. They tend to be pretty similar. So although there's funding in Ontario, there's funding. I'm not sure if there's provincial money in Alberta at the moment. There's the government money, there's the CRTC funds, but all of them require a similar kind of set of things, which is that you need money from multiple sources and you need the capacity to put together the business case. So if you don't have that skill set in your community, then you can't provide a competitive application and you're not going to get funded. So even though the federal government's project is called the Universal Broadband Fund, as long as it's competitive, it's not universal. So I think we need to look at some, those, it's not to say that those, that model isn't going to deliver results, and it has delivered results, but I think we need to look at additional mechanisms as well. So maybe we need things where you don't, as a community, you don't need to get funding from 3 different sources. Maybe we're looking more at loans, guaranteed loans, government-backed loans or something. I think there are other options, and I don't have a good collection of examples at my fingertips, but I think that's our next step, is to say what isn't working in the existing programs that could be done differently. And I think many people on this call have suggestions there.
Go ahead, Rob.
Yeah, great. Thanks for the talk and the contribution. The book's fantastic, Catherine. I just have a question about how policymakers treat spectrum, both in Canada and then from the other international examples you have. So, you know, in Canada, we have ISED that's kind of in charge with spectrum management, and then the CRTC that regulates fiber optics and other types of, you know, fixed infrastructure. And I was just wondering about that side of things. Like, is it organized differently from a regulator or policy perspective in different countries?
It is. And I'm just trying to think, in the book, there isn't really a whole lot of discussion of this, but in general, it's the telecom regulator who has the spectrum policy piece of it, and that's the recommendation that's being made repeatedly in Canada. We're not there yet, but I think that's generally accepted as a good practice.
Thanks. Any last questions here? I think we're at the top of the hour, so we'll look at wrapping up, unless anybody has anything else to ask. There's a lot of questions I could ask. Some really stimulating points came out of that. Not the least of which is the history behind the license exempt spectrum and the movement to allocate ISM bands to license exempt, and how that's been such a boon for innovation. But I think the book itself is really important contribution, as Greg pointed out at the beginning, around bringing this conversation back in, or bringing it into social sciences and humanities as well, and thinking about these questions as they relate to our communication systems. So I'd like to thank you, Catherine, for taking time to join us, and of course thank Greg for his time as well. Thank you all in the audience for joining us. It's great to see this turnout, and I would encourage you to well, pick up a copy of the book and have a look at it, use it in your courses, and certainly try to, if you find this area interesting, stay in touch with others, and let's see if we can get, you know, more of a critical mass of academics in social science and humanities taking a continued interest in the area. Okay, thank you all again.
So much,
have
Gordon,
a great day, everybody.
For the invitation.